Thank you, Danny, for the nice introduction. So as said by Danny, this will be my topic today. So I will briefly go through the outline to give an idea what I will be covering. So I will first give you a brief introduction to English almost and then barely, and also Cantonese approximative in sentence final positions. And then after that, I will point out the distinct features of the two Cantonese sentence final particle, 乜仔 and 咁仔, making the pair different from each other. This will be followed by the first distinct features, which is related to polarity. And then the second will be the second distinct feature, which is related to the scalar feature. So I will propose a scalar account to account for the semantics of 乜仔 and 咁仔. Finally, it comes to a conclusion, which will highlight the division of labor of the two components, the proximal component and then the polar minimizing component, Cantonese approximative. Okay, so I will first briefly go through the introduction of the two familiar English approximative adverbs, almost and then barely. So previous analysis consider the two as approximative adverbs. The semantics and then pragmatic properties of this pair of adverbs have been the subject of much debate in the literature. Basically, there are at least two reasons for that one. The first basic reason is if they share the same basic semantics of marking the approximation or closeness, why we need two, in what way the two are different from each other so that we need two items with the same basic meaning. So this is actually related to the second reason, because somehow the two, in terms of meaning components, they show a kind of asymmetric relationship. In other words, the two, even though they share the same basic semantics, but they are not exactly the same. So that's why we need both. So to capture the meaning in the literature, the meaning of the two has been accounted for by some kind of conjunctive analysis, which is the conjunction of two propositions, which in semantics we call propositions, and then in the basic linguistics we call sentences. So they include two different meaning components. The first one, as said before, the proximal component. The second one, the polar component. So sentence 1 and then 2 are given in previous analysis. We'll see how the two components operate in order to tell the difference between the two. Sentence 1A, John almost missed the train. 2A, John barely missed the train. The two sentences, they're exactly the same, except of one having almost, the other one having barely. For the first one, John almost missed the train. For the proximal component, the meaning becomes John came close to missing the train. Came close basically show the proximity or the proximal relationship between with the propositions. The polar component basically reverse the polarity from the original P, which is the original sentence, John missed the train, to negative P, becoming that the sentence, the negative version become true. In other words, in reality, John did not miss the train. For barely, basically, it is similar. However, what is interesting is for the proximal component, it is John came close to not P, but negative P, not missing the train. So that's why in previous analysis, people argue that barely somehow seems to be a negative version of almost, even though the sentence does not have any negator. It is affirmative in form. However, in the proximal component, it is negative P, but not P. So that's why people argue that barely somehow has a kind of negative meaning hidden in there. For the polar component, the operation will be similar to almost. If the original in the proximal component is negative P, then the polar component will reverse the polarity to P. In other words, the sentence John missed the train becomes true in 2A. However, what is interesting is if the exact nature of proximity in the two, 1A and 2B, is very difficult to grasp. In other words, it's difficult to define in what way we say that it is closeness or proximity, how to measure the closeness. And then what is interesting is in 1A and then 2A, why we do not directly say John did not miss the train in 1 or John missed the train in 2. Why we need the two components? So if we do one level up for the abstraction, we can see that for almost and then barely, we can provide a kind of propositional schemata for the approximative, which again is the conjunction of the two components. For example, like 3, the component will be things came close to P being the case. Polar, reverse the polarity. to become negative P. Barely P, then proximal component become, things came close to negative P, and then polar, reverse the polarity, become P equals to 1. So if, as first approximation, if you look at what's going on, 1 to 4 are given to show the theoretical assumptions of the proximal and polar components we use to account for the approximative in natural language. However, as I said earlier, there are more complications than what the surface representation is showing. The first complication is the definition of the proximity or closeness. The core meaning of the two basically is captured through a relation of proximity and then closest. However, what is proximity? How close can we say is close? How to measure the proximity? The second complication coming from the polarity. Although both adverbs, they make reference to a polar switch between the negative and then positive one. So in the case of the almost, switching from the P to negative P. In the barely, switching from the negative P to P. So it seems that the two adverbs just switch between the negative and then the positive orientation. However, the thing is, for almost, from missing the train P to not missing the train, the transition seems to be oriented towards the negative P area. Barely in 2, from not missing the train to negative P to missing the train P, the transition is oriented towards the P area. However, the question is, if there's a switch between the polarity, is the difference between the two determined by the lexical meaning of barely and almost? The two meaning components, the proximal and then the polar components, they're very important. However, they are not equally the same for the interpretation of almost and then barely. At least negative P in almost and P for barely. However, the way the two meaning components, how they model, is not really clearly specified in previous analysis. Yet, it is not only the issues of English. Think about the case of cross-linguistic significance. Approximative is not only being found in English, but across languages as well. Somehow, because the basic meaning is closest or approximation, every language we need to indicate this kind of meaning. However, in natural language, they will express the same meaning in different morphosyntactic categories: determiners, sentence final particles, or adverbs. If we consider the two meaning components, there is robust evidence for the asymmetric status of the two components already, and then both are adverbs. However, if you compare adverbs with determiner or even sentence final particles, the differences will be more drastic. So are the two meaning components realized in the same way cross-linguistically? This is a question which we need to ask. So in order to find out more about the cross-linguistic data, in this talk, we focus more on Cantonese. However, before we move on to the Cantonese data, one thing which we need to emphasize is Chinese or Cantonese, they do have some kind of approximative adverbs. For example, in Chinese, 差不多, 差不多, and then 几乎, 几乎, and then 差一点, 差啲, and then 差一点没, 差啲冇. So all these are very complicated. Even they are adverbs, they are not exactly the same as English almost and then barely. So we'll leave this the approximative adverbs in Chinese for later studies first. However, in this talk, we focus more on the two sentence vowel particle in Cantonese, 乜仔 and 咁仔. The question here is why we pick these two. Somehow, originally, we focus a lot more on the adverbs. And then these two, 乜仔 and 咁仔, they appear in this positions, at least in terms of the morphosyntactics, they're very different from adverb. The first question we ask will be what? If we are talking about approximative regarding these two, can we consider that it is something like almost appearing in the sentence final positions? If it is almost in the sentence final positions, what would the semantics or the meaning look like? However, at the very beginning, we find that if we consider 乜仔 and 咁仔, basically, there are at least two very interesting features. The first one is they demonstrate high sensitivity towards polarity in their interpretation, which already is not really exactly the same as the English almost. And then the second one is what? We find that for the 乜仔 and 咁仔, they show a kind of meaning component or meaning which is additional to the proximal and then polar. We call them the minimal property. So the minimal property makes a point in a minimal or small interval from the scalar boundary. So these two interesting features, we'll be covering them in detail when we move on to the presentations. However, just highlight that one is proximity, which is a kind of unique to 乜滯 and 咁滯. The second will be proposing a kind of additional meaning component on top of almost and barely. Not only the proximal and then the polar, but something minimal. So we now move on to closely examine the two features. The first feature will be in terms of polarity. If we talk about in terms of polarity, we need to find out the difference of 乜滯 and 咁滯 towards the negative and affirmative context. What is interesting is 5 basically. 我冇睇過本書乜滯，冇 and then 乜滯 the negator and 乜滯. The second one 我冇睇過本書咁滯 negator and then negator 冇 and then 咁滯. The two sentences here showing that both 乜滯 and 咁滯 they can appear in the negative context, and then it seems that in this regard the two doesn't show any differences. However, what is interesting is the affirmative version. Sentence 6, 佢食完碗飯咁滯 good. However, 佢食完碗飯乜滯 is unacceptable. So sentence 6 show that only 咁滯 but not 乜滯 can occur in affirmative context. This is the first point. So in other words, the two basically show some kind of variation in terms of their occurrence with negative and affirmative context. 乜滯 can only go with negative. 咁滯 negative and affirmative, both are good. This is the first point. The second point is what's going on in 6. 6 you have the 完, which is the finish in terms of the gross. In other words, the top end of the scale. If you consider the quantity of eating a bowl of rice, then completion will be the top end. So the sentence here is showing that 咁滯 basically can go with the top end of the scale. However, what 咁滯 needs basically is not the top end. What it needs actually is a boundary. So in other words, you have some point which you can close off the event. 咁滯 will be happy to be there. So for example, like 7. 我睇到本書一半，一半 definitely does not give you the top end. However, it does close off the boundary of the reading to half only. In other words, what we are saying here is what? For 咁滯, it occur in the affirmative one. It needs a boundary, and then either it can be the top end, like the completion or the finish point, which indicate earlier in 6, or in the case of 7, just a kind of a half, which can close off the boundary. That will also be good for 咁滯. However, what's the issues of 乜滯 then? For sentence 8, 我冇睇完本書乜滯. 乜滯 cannot occur with 完, even though the sentence is in a negative form. For sentence 8, it is exactly the same as the earlier affirmative sentence of 咁滯. However, 咁滯 can go with 完, but 乜滯, even we give the negator there, it cannot go with 完. So the proximal, the reason, if you really want to explain why this, so it is a kind of easy to explain. The proximal meaning assert that the speaker came close to negative P. That is, he or she or I did not finish reading the book. However, this somehow seems to be contradictory with the after the polar meaning comes into play. I have finished reading the book. So that's why the contradiction between the two makes the sentence a little bit odd. However, we put aside the account to the unacceptability of 8 first. What we want to show you is the data. And then for sentence 9, if you look at what's going on, it's interesting. 我冇睇過本書咁滯. For sentence 8, negative, and then the what? The point is the completion point, the top of the scale. For 9, it is not the top of the scale. Rather, it is the bottom of the scale. I came close of not having read the book. It seems that 乜滯 indeed can go with this kind of sentence if what you provide is the bottom, this low end of the scale, but not the top end. So in other words, so far what we can see here is we conclude what's going on between 乜滯 and 咁滯 in terms of the polarity. 乜滯 can only occur with the negative sentence. 咁滯 can go with affirmative and negative one. The second point is 咁滯 can go with the top end of the scale. 乜滯 can go only with the low end of the scale, but not the top. This is at least what we can see from the section over here. As I mentioned earlier, the next distinctive feature will be the minimal meaning of 乜滯 and 咁滯. English almost and barely, they show two basic semantic components found earlier, as we mentioned before, the proximal component and the polar component. However, look at sentence 10, 佢冇睇過本書乜滯. The reading of the sentence somehow is I came close of not having read the book. I read the book, but read little only. So the polar and then the proximal is still there. In other words, the I came close of not having read the book is the proximal component. It came close to negative P being the case. So that's why it become I came close of not having read the book, which is the first part of the sentence. And the polar switch the polarity from negative to affirmative, negative, negative P. So it becomes I read the book, which is the result of the polar component. However, what is missing is the final part. I read little only. This additional minimum meaning somehow seems to be occurring in 10A, but the previous analysis of the polar and then the proximal component, they don't cover this part, minimal component. The quantity that was read is minimal or small. In other words, the polar will give the reading what I read the book. The minimal component will require that the reading must be the minimal one, which is the red the sentence in red in yellow over here. In other words, 10A give an additional reading of even P is true. The occurrence of P must be minimal or very small in terms of quantity or degree. That depends on what the sentence is indicating. And then, as we mentioned earlier, 今制 can occur in both affirmative and negative contexts. Let's see whether the minimal reading is still there. 今制 when it occur in the negative sentence, like 我冇睇過本書咁滯. So again, just like what we have for the 乜滯 in the negative sentence, the minimal component is still there. I came close on not having read the book. I read the book, but read little only. So in other words, the minimal component on top of the proximal, which is things came close to negative P, polar, switching the polarity to P, and then minimal require that even though the event did occur, it must occur to the minimal or to the minimal amount. So this was indicating in yellow over here. So in other words, concluding here, in both negative contexts, regardless of whether it is 乜滯 or 咁滯, there is an additional minimal meaning component. The minimal meaning say that negative P or P is true, but it has to occur to a minimal, which is here in the case of 咁滯 will be B3. What about the 咁滯 in the affirmative context then? So let's look at sentence 12. 我睇完本書咁滯. I came close to finish reading the book, but I didn't finish reading it, but I'm very close to finishing it. Again, the first part will be the proximal component. The second part will be the polar component. So with I as the reference point, the proximal component would give the meaning that I came close to finish reading the book, which is B1 over here. The polar component gives negative P. The speaker did not finish reading the book, B2. With negative P to be true and additional minimal reading, the distance from I, which is the completion point indicated by Yun over here, is minimal. This result in B3, which is the distance. This result in meaning of the distance to finish reading the book is minimal. So again, with negative P to be true, which is I didn't finish reading the book, which is the result of the polar component, an additional minimal meaning is given here, which is the distance from I, the completion point in 12A is minimal. So this is what you have in 12B3. So with the data here, let's give an interim summary. So 乜滯 and 咁滯, basically they show the following properties, which are kind of have around 5 properties. 乜滯 and 咁滯 are schematized by the proximal component, the polar component, and what is additional is the minimal component. And then 乜滯 can only appear in a negative context, not affirmative ones. And then 乜滯 cannot interpret with the verbal complements denoting the top end of the scale, just like the yun. 咁滯 can appear in both negative and affirmative contexts. And in affirmative context, 咁滯 needs to interpret with a reference point. And the point can either be the top end of the scale or any point on the scale in affirmative context. The point can be just the middle one or any point which can close off the scale. That will be good enough for 咁滯. So the preliminary summary above suggests 2 very important points. Firstly, it is the last one. In affirmative context, the case of 咁滯, namely that 咁滯 can interpret with a reference point on the scale, which can be the top end of the scale. Secondly, minimal reading are found in the sentences with 乜滯 and 咁滯, suggesting that there exists a kind of limit point on my path, which consists of some order points. Because when you want to see that something is minimal distance to a certain point, the points you originally on the path must be ordered. Otherwise, you cannot measure the minimal distance. Both observations eventually has led to a very clear point that there is a close connection of Mazai and Gamzai with scale. So before we move on to propose a scalar model for the pair, we first need to confirm their close relation with polarity and then scalarity, because these two relations will eventually kind of confirm that the Mazai and Gamzai, they are indeed scalar particles. Okay, so let's look at the first previous the polarity first. So let's look at briefly the definition in previous analysis regarding the definition of the polarity. Negative polarity items, which is MPI, must be within the scope of a downward entailing operator and be licensed by it. To make it easy, it means that negation will be one of the downward entailing operator. Just consider the downward entailing operator as the negator. In other words, 13A basically means that if you have an item, and if it is a negative polarity items, it must be within the syntactic scope of the negator. So the formal definition you can find in 13A, the Lorentz licensing condition, and MPI is grammatical only if it is in the scope of a downward entailing expressions. So an example with similarly what you have in English. For example, in English, if you use any, I didn't eat any food. Any, because we say that it is a negative polarity items, it must be within the scope of not. So that's why it can only appear in the form of I did not eat any food, but it cannot appear in I ate any food. So this is the basic reading why what people said about the negative polarity items. In other words, English any is its negative polarity items because it relies on the negator not in order to kind of occur. Similar the case of in the Cantonese or in the Chinese as well. However, this kind of strict syntactic definition somehow, come across a lot of challenges. So that's why eventually we have studies which loosen there, but in other words, they do not go to the strict definition about the syntactic definition. Somehow they say that the pragmatics one and then even the contextual one, as long as you have the context or the pragmatics, which allows you to have the negative polarity items to appear, that will be good, even though the negator in terms of syntax is not a kind of licensing relationship with the MPI. So in other words, we don't go into too details regarding the definition. However, the basic point is the last one, which is the end of this slide. Negative polarity items do not always occur within the scope of the negation or in the scope of the downward entailing operator. So this is a definition. Somehow people try to loosen the definition. In other words, to give a brief summary here, originally we have a strict syntactic licensing. In other words, in terms of syntax, in terms of structure, the negator must be in a kind of C commanding relationship or in the top governing the occurrence of the negative polarity items, then this will be good. However, eventually, linguists are kind of losing the definition. If this kind of syntactic licensing can be violated, as long as your context or your pragmatics allow the negative polarity items to occur, that will be good. So this is a basic definition regarding previous analysis on polarity. However, what's going on, in what way this is related to the Mazai or Gamzai? So far, if you recall the Mazai, we mentioned that Mazai can only appear in negative polarity in the negative context. If it relies on the negator to occur, can we say that it is a negative polarity items? This will be eventually be an important point because somehow if it relies on the, so far for all the components we mentioned that the polar component is always reverse ordering of what you have originally. So in other words, whether it is negative or affirmative, it does affect the scalar ordering of these two approximative sentence final particle. So that's why we need to look a little bit on whether Mazai can be considered as a negative polarity item. So this kind of analysis has been covered as early as 10 in 2006-2009. An example given by him is in 16, 我冇去Mazai. He claimed that because he goes with the kind of strict syntactic definition. So in other words, mo, which is a negator, it must be in a wider scope over the Mazai. So which is shown in yellow over here. So the reading eventually derived that for 16, the reading is more like he did not go much at all. So in other words, did not, the not after did, it will be coming from mo, and then go much according to him in coming from matzai. So in other words, for this kind of reading, he's saying that it must be the only reading of 16, and then it is the result from this kind of syntactic relation. However, according to us, we consider that the relationship between the negator mo and then matzai, it cannot be in the direct scope negation as indicated over here. Why? If we consider the same sentence here, we consider that if we go with our analysis so far, if it's indeed the negator scope over the matzai, it should be he did not go much at all, which is suggested by Tang 206. However, we consider no, somehow it seems that the reading of 17 should be he came close to the situation of not having gone. In other words, came close, which is the reading given by matzai, it occurred as in a wider scope over the original matzai. Okay, so in other words, what I'm saying is for 17, it should be matzai, which is came close. So 佢冇去乜滯 which is the approximative. And then if you look at the English translation, it is came close. However, the negator mo, it is not having gone. So in other words, if you want to get the right reading for 16, which we write it as 17, it should be the 乜滯 having a scope over the mo, which is given the reading over here. So what we are saying here is what we saying that we agree with Tang that or previous analysis that 乜滯 because they rely on the negativity in order to occur is indeed a negative polarity items. However, to make the kind of theoretical feasible, what we are saying here is what the relationship between the two is not a syntactic relation, or it is not a direct scope relation. Rather, it is something which is governed by semantics. So in other words, 乜滯 it relies on the negativity in order to occur, because in terms of meaning, it relies on some kind of scale which can only be derived by the negative context. So this is something which we are kind of coming up over here regarding the relationship between the matzai and then the negator. And then in fact, if we're really saying that this kind of relationship, it is not coming from the strict syntactic definition. So I can give you an additional example. So this one may be a little bit difficult. However, one thing which is also interesting is what in terms of negative polarity items, if it is going with the syntactic licensing relationship, it should be able to occur in the antecedent part of a conditional sentence. 18 is a conditional sentence because you have 如果 and then you have the main clause, which is the second line. 我哋冇同佢去商場咯。So 如果阿女唔會嘈住買嘢乜滯，我哋冇同佢去商場咯。This sentence is not acceptable. However, basically it's a negator, and then 乜滯 also the MPI both occur in the antecedent part. If we really go with the syntactic licensing relationship, this sentence should be predicted to be grammatical, because one feature of the negative polarity items is it can go with the negator in the antecedent clause of a conditional sentence. And the 18 definitely showing that it is not that case. So the conclusion will be, yes, 乜滯 is a negative polarity items. However, the relationship may not be that straightforward. It is not syntactic licensing, but semantic one as well. Which is definitely, this is the conclusion. As an MPI, distinct properties are revealed by matzai. Regarding the scope relation between the negator and matzai, it neither observes the C-commanding constraint of the MPI at the surface structure. Secondly, it does not observe a direct scope relationship between the negator and then the MPI. In terms of the theoretical significance, it supports the Homer, the analysis, saying that MP9 do not always occur within the scope of the negation, or in the scope of the downward entailing or the negation context. Rather, it can be something contextual. In other words, matzai in fact support what the last point, which is mentioned in the previous analysis of polarity. So just at this point of time, just give a conclusion regarding the matzai and gamzai in terms of polarity. So probably this will be easier to understand, which is part B over here. Matzai can only appear in the negative context. So that's why we term matzai as a negative polarity item, which is MPI. Gamzai, it can appear in both affirmative and a negative context. So the term we'll be using is it can be both be an MPI and then PPI. So that's why we vaguely call it a kind of polarity item. So the first one here is the polarity, was a little bit complicated because of a syntactic reasoning pattern. However, the next one, which is a kind of important, is the scalarity properties of Mazda and Gamzai. If we want to take a step further, because so far at least we need to account for the minimal component of the two, and also the highly sensitivity of the pair to polarity. In order to account for these two, our proposal is they are scalar operator, or they are scalar adverbs. So before we really prove that they are scalar adverbs, so showing you how the two function as a scalar adverbs, there are two types of relationship which we need to confirm first. The first relation is the relationship between scalarity and proximity. The second one is the relationship between scalarity and polarity. In other words, what we are claiming here is proximity, which is typical feature of approximative, and polarity, which is a kind of unique feature of Mazda and Gamzai. Both are related to the scalarity properties of the in semantics. The first one, relation between scalarity and proximity. The concept of scale in shaping the interpretation of proximity actually has already been mentioned in previous work on Italian approximative adverb already, the corsi, which is English, similar to English adverb almost. And then in Cantonese, Lee 2013, they conduct preliminary study saying that regardless of whether it's the approximative in Mandarin Chinese or Cantonese, basically is due to a kind of scalar orientation. However, for Lee 2013, she doesn't work on the semantic modeling. So the second relation is between scalarity and then polarity. In fact, previous analysis already mentioned that polarity items has long been taken as a special class, which they call scalar operator. So previous analysis saying that they are forms which must be interpreted with respect to an appropriately structured scalar model. In other words, if you want to say something as a polarity items, it has to go with the polar of the propositions, which must be on a platform which is structured and then scalar. So in consideration of the high sensitivity of Gamzai and Mazai towards polarity, we can put forward a kind of hypothesis. Their polarity interpretation is attributed by their sensitivity towards scalar inferencing or scalar reasoning. So basically why they are highly sensitive to polarity, because they need to satisfy some kind of scalar requirement. In order to further capture the scalar semantics of Mazai and Gamzai, we recapture what we observed so far, which is in 19123. So Mazai and Gamzai, we hypothesize that they are scalar particles. As scalar particles, the two are compatible with gradable parity. The second one, Mazai is compatible with gradable parakeets in negative context. And then 3, Gamzai is compatible with gradable parakeet in both negative and affirmative context. In case of affirmative context, it can include the top end of the scale or any non-top reference point which can close off the scale. So this is a picture which we will be showing you now. So a quick question here is what we call the minimal component. To satisfy the minimal component, should we assume that points are ordered then? So basically the answer is quite clear now. It must be, because if you talk about minimal, it must be according to how the points are ordered on the scale or on the platform. Actually, Iswell, as early as 2011, he assumed that polarity items are forms which denote an element within a scalar ordering, which I've mentioned earlier. Following the assumptions of Iswell, to make the scalar ordering clearer, this is the assumption we'll be taking, the ABC here. In other words, a scale can compose of either quantities or degree, but they are not in a kind of discrete points. In other words, it spans over the entire surface, entire platform, instead of just point 1, point 2, point 3 discretely. So in other words, just a continuum. And then the order is arranged in terms of smaller or equal to or greater or equal to just a normal comparison between quantities or degree. And then regardless of what kind of entities you're talking about, they can be put the scale and then can be ordered. We say that they're scalar. So along this line then, if Mazai and Gamzai are considered scalar operator and they are highly sensitive to polarity, we may consider the relation of all the points on the scale with the positive and negative polarities. Scalar orientation Scalar orientations, we have two types, scale preserving and scale reversing. Polarity sensitivity is a sensitivity to scalar inference, as we mentioned earlier. The negator is taken as a true functional operator. It will operate on the proposition, and negative polarity items would operate within a model with scalar orientation reversed by the negator. So it is the function of the negator to reverse the polarity. So the assumption will be points on the scalar order. Scale reversing and then scale preserving are the two types of inferences or scale orientation. So what do you mean by scale reversing? It is typically the feature of negative polarity items, because it will be what? It will be reverse the scalar orientation of the original propositions. However, for the positive polarity items, it will operate with the scalar orientation preserved. In other words, it doesn't have the negator, because it doesn't have a negator, then the original orientation, usually from top to low, it will remain as top to low without any reversal effect. So to make the point clearer, let's look at table 1 over here. As I mentioned earlier, we have two types, scale preserving, scale reversing. So assuming that, so you have the arrow over here in table 1. This is a kind of in what way the ordering is done, the scalar ordering. If it's scale preserving, it will be from high to low, and then it will be just from high to low, usually in the affirmative context, without reversing. However, if it's scale reversing, then it will be from the original high to low, it is reversed from the low to high, which is shown in the arrow over here. So these are the two types of scalar ordering, which you can see in the nature of the scalar ordering. In other words, scale preserving is more like a descending order, and then scale reversing is more like an ascending order, which is shown clearly by the direction of the arrow over here. So this is what to make the assumption easier. This will be in 20A and then 20B. Scale preserving, licensing inferences from high to low values in the direction of descending order. This is the main point. Scale reversing, the licensing inferences will be from low to high because the order is being kind of switched over, and it will be in the direction of ascending order, which is what you can show in the direction of the arrow over here. Okay, so before we move on to the actual example, let's see if we assume scalar ordering in that way, what impact will we have Matzai first? And then after that, we'll use the actual sentences to prove that the analysis will work in Matzai. The framework will be something in here shown in 4.3.1. First, the two meaning components of Matzai. Firstly, consider the meaning components which we mentioned earlier. As an approximative, the proximal components gives rise to the meaning of proximity, which assert that things came close to, in the case of Matzai, negative p being the case. The proximal component is close to any previous literature which we mentioned about proximity. However, what is interesting about the two components, the polar and then the minimal components. For the polar part, it is to reverse the polarity of the projectant propositions from negative to p. As an MPI, the projectant proposition occurring in Matzai is negative p. The polar will have the original negative p changed to p. Apart from this, while the proximal component reveals the nature of Matzai as an approximative, the polar minimal component not only reveals the basic semantics of Matzai as an API, but by nature a scalar particle as well. To make the relevant properties specific, you can consider 21 over here. First, as a scalar particle, the obligatory presence of Matzai with the negator is to make the orientation from low values to high value, as shown by the arrow over here. The polar will reverse the direction of the arrow, becoming from low to high to low, which is the second one. And then how the minimal component operate, because after the polar component, the direction of the arrow landed at the low end. So that's why the minimal component will operate according to the low end of the scale. In other words, the proximal component, the polar component, and then the minimal component, all these three components are closely related to how the scalar ordering is being done. So the polar component has switched the ordering of the scale, and the minimal component will operate according the so-called landing site after the polar component comes into play. Okay, so let's look at the example here. You see how how 21 operate over here. 22, 佢冇去3次乜滯. According to previous analysis like proposed by 10, 22 is ungrammatical. Somehow, if you look at what's going on, 3 times, it is not the low end of the scale. So you can guess that it is unacceptability coming from. However, 23, if we modify the sentence a little bit, 佢冇去3次乜滯，1次半次啦, the sentence become good. However, the issue here is what 23 includes a second clause, which is 1次半次, which assert the minimal frequency, the bottom part of the scale. So that's why the minimal part can go with this kind of what the minimal component can interpret with the low end of the scale if you add in the 1次半次. So this makes your 23A the sentence better than the previous version over here because you have properly introduced the low end of the scale. So to show how the scalarity works in 23, this is what we can conclude over here. In other words, with 23 as a negative proposition, negative p, the direction of the original scale inferencing is from low to high. The typical thing about this, the negative version. The polar will reverse the polarity from negative p to p. So it switched from the low to high, becoming high to low. Because it's from high to low, so that's why it will be lies on the bottom end of the scale, where your minimal component can operate. So that's why if you add in 一次半次 once or so, then you formally introduce the minimal point. So that's why the sentence makes sense if you have the 乜滯 occurring over there. So the summary here, what we are showing is 乜滯 requires a quantity of degree associated with it to be a minimal distance from the low end. So if you put it in a diagram, this will be in something like 25. So the low end, and then this is where the minimal component coming from. Okay. So and then let's see what's going on with 咁滯 then. For 咁滯, we have two meaning components. Following the above line of arguments, 乜滯 is not compatible with the verbal complements indicating the top end or the non-low end of the scale. If you go back to the cases, it will be 26. 佢冇食完碗飯乜滯 is ungrammatical. However, if you change the sentence into the affirmative one, 佢食完碗飯咁滯, the sentence is good. So because 完 basically marks the completion point of the event, which is the top boundary of the event, its incompatibility with 乜滯 is naturally predict. However, 咁滯 is fine here. For 咁滯, both 咁滯 and 乜滯, they are scalar operator, but their semantics are distinct from each other, as you see from the example just now. Differences in scale selection. 乜滯 needs to be licensed by indicator. It is restricted to select a scale which is from low to high end, the scale reversing type. For 咁滯, it is more flexible towards scale selection. It can go with a scale of low to high values in a negative context, or high to low values in affirmative one. In other words, 咁滯 go with scale reversing or scale preserving one. So if you look at the so if you look at this, how the entire the story of operate over here. So the component of 咁滯 can be taken as follow. While the proximal component assert that it comes close to the projection proposition being the case, depending on 咁滯 occurs in negative or affirmative context. If 咁滯occurs in negative context, it will be negative p as shown here. If it occurs in affirmative context, it will be p over here as shown here. So for the polar and then the minimal component, the polar component will reverse the polarity of the projection propositions from negative p to p if it is in the negative context, and then it will be from p to negative p if it's affirmative context as shown over here. So the minimal distance will be operating in the way of what? In the way that it will mark a minimal distance from the scalar boundary, from the low end boundary if it is in the negative context. And then it will be in the affirmative context, we will be marking the minimal distance from the top end or the high end boundary as shown here. Okay, so generalizing what we are showing so far, it will mean that whether 咁滯 is a minimizing type MPI or minimizing type PPI is determined by the polarity of the proposition. It will be a minimizing type MPI if it occurs in negative context, but a minimizing type PPI if it occurs in the affirmative one. So to give you one final example showing you how this operates over here. So 27A 佢冇睇過本書禁制 so this is where 禁制 occur in the negative context. 27B 佢睇完本書禁制 this is where 禁制 occur in the affirmative one. The meaning given by the proximal and then polar minimal component is given in 27A1 and A2, A1 and A2. If you look at the negative sentence, the proximal semantics of gamzai would be realized in the proximal component, giving the interpretation of he came close of not having read the book, as shown in 27A1. The polar component will reverse the polarity from negative P to negative P, giving he read the book. Under such a case, the scale will also be switched from one marking scalar inferencing from low to high values to one from high to low values. The minimum component will then mark a minimal distance now to the low end because the scale has been switched over, and then becoming the reading of he read the book but read little only, as shown in 27A2. However, in the case of the affirmative one, you have the yun, which is the completion point, the top end of the circle, of the scale. The proximal component will assert that it came close to P being the case. It came close to having finished reading the book, as shown in 27B1. On the other hand, the polar minimum component, you're suggesting that the polar component reversed the P to negative P. So that's how it becomes he didn't finish reading the book, as shown here. And then the minimal distance will operate according to the high end of the scale. So that's why you see what you have here in red is very close to having finished reading the book, which is given by the minimal component. Okay, so generalizing the pattern of gamzai and the matzai of gamzai as a polar item, what gamzai needs is a point to attain the minimal reading. Such a point can be the low end, the top end, or any point of the scale. If gamzai interprets the low end, it will be similar to matzai in its semantics as a minimizing type MPI. On the other hand, if gamzai select the top end or any point on the scale, its interpretation becomes a minimizing type PPI under such a case. So this is also the reading the diagram when gamzai operate in the affirmative one. In other words, the minimum distance will according to the top end. So this is what is shown here in 28. Okay. So I think that I think the content of the data is a little bit intense. So that's why it is time to give a conclusion here. So I mean, the conclusion first is given in table 2. Actually, what we want to show here is gamzai, matzai, and then actually the two, they are very sensitive to the polarity. And then polarity somehow is related to scale ordering. Originally, matzai and gamzai, they share one thing, they can go with a negative P. If you go with a negative P, in other words, the direction will be from low to high. So that's why originally they would select the scale reversing type. Gamzai, which is different from matzai, is it can go with the affirmative context. So that's why what you see over here is not low to high. It will go with the scale preserving one from high to low. In other words, regardless of what kind of reading given by gamzai and matzai, everything has go back to what they want in terms of scalar interpretation. So after they select either a negative P, for the matzai select a negative P. For the case of gamzai, either negative P or plus P, then eventually the polar and then the minimal component will comes into play. In the case of matzai, then the proximal, it will be the original negative P being select, the scale reversing one, and the polar will reverse the polarity, and then the order become high values to low values. So that's why the minimal meaning will be according to the low end, because it's becoming from high to low because the ordering has been swapped or switched. On the other hand, for the case of the gamzai, it will be, in the case of the affirmative one, negative one will be the same as the matzai. We will not repeat over here. What is interesting is gamzai, it occur in the affirmative one. Again, the proximal component, it will be selected P, which is scale preserving one. And then for the polar, you switch the order from the high to low, becoming to low to high. So that's why the direction of the arrow become pointing to the top end. Minimal then come into play, interpreting with the top end. So that's why the reading like almost finish reading the book, something like that. Okay, so in other words, what we are showing here is 咁就係乜就係 in terms of Cantonese, it is sentence file particle. And then at least if you compare with what you have regarding the English barely and then the almost, somehow it seems that they're not exactly the same. So in other words, the family of the entire for different languages will have different pattern, different realization. They're similar in one basic semantics, which is giving you the proximity. However, there's a lot of details making they are not exactly the same. If you want to go into detailed comparison among the approximative in natural language, you need to go into more data. And then Mandarin, Chinese, Cantonese, or even your own dialect, you enrich the entire family to know what's going on regarding approximation. So the later will be the references here. I think I have to stop here. I will return the microphone to Danny. Thank you.
Okay.